Hey everyone, welcome back to part 2 of my Xbox retrospective. Today I am going through the games released from 2004 onwards for the Xbox. If you didn't check out the first part, go check it out. I go through all the Xbox games that I think are notable, that I think are worth checking out, and that I love from before 2004. So there's a ton of stuff in there. And let's get right into this stuff. First off, if you haven't watched my videos, you'll know that I love when games are bundled together. These 3 games came out on the PS2, but it's nice to have one package, and this is the Silent Scope collection. It comes with all 3 of the arcade games, and it comes with, I think, the console version, probably the Dreamcast version then, for Silent Scope 1. And if you haven't played Silent Scope, it's a really cool light gun shooter where you're a sniper. You basically look through your sniper scope and take out enemies from far away. And the Xbox controls work pretty well for it. There is a very specific sniper light gun that came out for it that's only useful for this game. I don't have that, but I still think the game is a blast to play on its own. That brings us right to Unreal 2 The Awakening. Now, the Unreal series is one I love, but the championship and tournament games are really designed with a multiplayer in focus, and it's a bit hard to go back to them. You know, it's hard to want to play those again. You always just play the newest one. And in this case, it's a sequel to the first Unreal. It is built on the same engine that Unreal Championship was built on, and it's got a complete story-driven single-player mode. So I actually really dug this the first time I played it. I popped it in the other day to try it again. It still holds up, I think, but back then when I played it, I liked it almost as much as Halo. I think it's a great game, and it's one that people don't really talk about, so I recommend checking it out if you like first-person shooters. Next is a crazy one that, again, not a lot of people know about, but Steel Battalion actually had a sequel called Line of Contact. Now, it's not really a sequel, it's more of an online expansion for that game, and so it brings a whole bunch of new online missions and different modes to the game. The modes support up to 10 players. You can use a LAN to get some players together. I don't know if you can get the full 10 or not. Maybe you could only get 2. Again, it uses the same Steel Battalion giant mech controllers that was shipped with the first game. It's got an interesting campaign mode. They call it a campaign mode. It's not single player, but it's basically a persistent online campaign mode where these 4 or 5 factions are duking it out. So that's a neat thing to have for something of this magnitude. You know, if you're going to go through the trouble of buying those, if you're going to go through the trouble of owning and setting up those giant mech sticks, it's nice to have a mode that you can go in every day and just do a little bit more on. Next up, one of the big heavy hitters for Xbox, the must-have, Ninja Gaiden. Now, designed by Itagaki and Team Ninja, using, Ryu, who is obviously the mainstay of Ninja Gaiden, but at this point probably most popular for the DOA series. This is a crazy action game. It was really good. It is really good. It still holds up. The action genre was going a bit stale. Devil May Cry did help quite a bit in it, but Ninja Gaiden, I think, really reinvigorated the genre. It has super hard, punishing gameplay, but really rewarding. Great mechanics, a fun story for Ninja Gaiden, really cool level and boss design. If you haven't played this or a version of it, I highly recommend it. Next up is a game I used to have. I don't have it anymore, but thinking about it, I'm kind of curious about it again. I think I should pick it up and try again. Which is a really cool game published by Namco. That's a first-person brawler. ThinkCondemned, but it was released way earlier. In this game, you play a super soldier who's got their powers from this alien crash site, and they're fighting back against this unknown enemy. The game uses the first-person view to some really interesting mechanics. You have to kind of look at things when you interact with them. You can't just kind of press a button and not be looking at it. Even to pick up ammo, you have to look down at the ammo. So you're kind of making these motions in a first-person perspective that are realistic, but that you would never typically do in other games. It's got some really cool combat, first-person brawler stuff, and some really neat superpowers, and I think it's totally worth checking out again. Next up is Thief Deadly Shadows, the follow-up to the PC hits Thief 1 and 2. This kind of stealth first-person action game was really popular amongst stealth fans. It really used that light and dark mechanic, so stay in the dark to stay hidden, sneak around, complete your objectives, so maps were more open. And this one is just as good as those original PC ones. Maybe not just as good, but it comes close. And it's a shame with the state the series is in now, but yeah, this was a big deal at the time for this to come to Xbox. Next up, Chronicles of Riddick: Escape from Butcher Bay. This is an really cool first-person adventure game done by Starbreeze, who later did The Darkness. It features a lot of that same kind of adventure elements. You play as Vin Diesel, or rather Riddick, who is trapped in Butcher Bay prison. You have to kind of get through the prison, find your way out. There's a ton of collecting smokes and trading with prisoners. Like, there are contained areas where you kind of complete a bunch of objectives before you move on to the next area. It just feels really open. The mission structure works really well. It adds a lot of depth to a first-person shooter kind of game, and I love that universe too. That Riddick universe is great. So now, obviously, this game has been released on PS3 and Xbox 360 as a kind of remastered version with a new secondary scenario, but this was an amazing game for the time, and yeah, only available on Xbox. Also worth mentioning is Sadecki, which is an Xbox exclusive action RPG with multiple party members. The player can switch between the members to use their different abilities, and it's one of the earliest examples of an action game combat system inside an action RPG. Next up is probably one of the biggest exclusives for the Xbox, which was Peter Molyneux's Fable. So, famously the game that Peter Molyneux overpromised on, or rather the first game he probably really overpromised on, but still set out to be a pretty cool action RPG with some really interesting world mechanics. You go on quests, you romance partners, it all boils down to some pretty basic mechanics, but it works really well. The world is really interesting and fun. It was a cool game and a good kind of action RPG. I think the Xbox didn't really have a ton of RPGs, so it was great to fill that gap. Back to adventure games, Siberia II, direct sequel to the original Siberia. Graphics and animation are better. The story continues right where the first game left off. There's a recap for the first game if you didn't play it. Yeah, this is one that gets a lot more love than Siberia 1. I think there's a version even coming out for Switch soon, so this game's legacy is still continuing. Next up is a game that a friend told me about a while ago, but I completely forgot about it until I was doing the list for this, and that is Kingdom Under Fire: The Crusaders. It's the sequel to Kingdom Under Fire, which was an RTS released on PC only, but this Xbox version, The Crusaders, seems to be a mashup of action RPG and Dynasty Warriors. So you're still on this huge field of war, and you're controlling these units, or these groups of armies one at a time, and you're performing the actions and combat to kind of take out your enemy army like Dynasty Warriors. It just sounds really cool. It sounds like Dynasty Warriors with some real-time strategy elements and some RPG mechanics, so I'm looking forward to finding a copy and checking it out. Hotoae II is the sequel to the first Hotoae. This one, you control Reiko again, but he's also joined by 5 other playable characters. And each of these playable characters have their own weapons, their own specials, really mix up the gameplay quite a bit. It's still a great action game. Again, it's one of those ones that's not really talked about, but definitely worth it if you have an Xbox. Next up is another game that I used to have, but I really feel like playing it again after doing this episode, is Outrun 2. So Outrun is the famous Sega arcade racer where you drive your Ferrari down a coast and try to beat the clock and take different paths for, some harder challenges. In this new version, everything's been updated, and there's 2 modes. There's your standard mode, and there's also this kind of heart attack mode where you have to kind of do different things to impress the girl you're riding in the car with. All that said, it's a really fun arcade racer, and like I said, I feel like playing it now, so I'm going to need to find a copy again. Which brings us to Dead or Alive Ultimate 1 and 2. So this nice bundle comes with both Dead or Alive 1 and 2, kind of ported from their previous systems, which I think are the Dead or Alive 1 was a PS1 game, Dead or Alive 2 was a PS2 game. They're really nice ports. They look really crisp. Of course, it's great to go back and see those old versions in play. 1 still looks and feels a bit dated, obviously, from the time, but 2 still looks almost as good as 3. It's a great game, and it's worth checking out these if you love the series. Next up is Tron 2.0 Killer App. This is one I haven't actually played yet. I only heard about it recently, and I was really interested to pick it up because I'm really starting to fall back in love with the Tron series, although it's kind of finished again now. But I love Tron Legacy, and I love that Disney XD show, and I really wanted to get back into Tron, so I've heard about this, picked it up. It is apparently pretty faithful to the original Tron vision. So this game has all what you'd expect from a Tron game. It's got your light cycles and your disc combat and all that stuff all set in the grid. And apparently it was officially the sequel to Tron before Legacy came out. So, I'd like to see what they thought would be a great sequel to Tron. Halo 2 is probably the most notable game on the system. The hype was huge for this game. Xbox Live was launched, so now Halo is online, and that was a big deal. Long after Halo 3 came out, people were still playing Halo 2 online. I never really got into Halo 2, to be honest. I really appreciated the first game, and the second game, I don't know why I never really got into it, but I've never been able to finish it, even on the Master Chief Collection. So I think I really need to get that missing gap in the story I have. I finished all the other Halo games. I know it's really interesting. They bring in the Arbiter, and I've played a bit of him. I feel like I'm talking a bit vague about something I really should have more knowledge about, but still, the multiplayer was where Halo 2 was at. Still, I think I will go back and finish that Master Chief Collection version soon. Next up is the Tom Clancy's Classic Trilogy, which is just something I have in my collection for a very specific reason, and that's because one of the discs is needed to mod one of my Xboxes, which I need to do to play a Japanese game for the show, so I'll get around to that sometime soon. But that said, these are three pretty great games. I mean, I don't think any of them were exclusive. Maybe Rainbow Six was, Rainbow Six 3. I do remember all three of them just getting a lot of playtime back then. Rainbow Six 3 especially was huge. So yeah, I mean, all three stealth games, Splinter Cell, Ghost Recon, Rainbow Six 3, the start of Splinter Cell and Ghost Recon, which are franchises people love, and I think Rainbow Six 3 may be the game that really put Rainbow Six on the map. New Vegas definitely helped after that, but definitely one of the high points of the series. Next up is Blinx 2. So we talked about Blinx earlier, the game that tried to make a new mascot for Microsoft that didn't do too well. Well, Blinx 2 came out and they introduced a new character, a pig named Tom Tom, and it scored okay. It did average, but I think it didn't really do that well overall. Microsoft has come out recently and said that the franchise is officially dead, so don't expect a new Blinx. I don't know if anyone really was, but I know it was a running joke for a while. Again, not a terrible game. The Xbox doesn't really have a lot of family-friendly platformers, so I guess that wasn't their audience at the time. So those games are cool if you want to see what an Xbox platformer was like, but other than that, it doesn't really stand out much. Star Wars, Knights of the Old Republic 2, The Sith Lords. Obsidian has a bit of a track record following BioWare. BioWare creates a franchise, and then Obsidian comes in and does the next game in the franchise while BioWare moves on to the next thing. This game did not get the kind of universal love that the first one did, but it's still a good game. It's still a really cool Star Wars game. It's a great follow-up to Old Republic, if not as good as that. At least it's still a good game. So check it out if you did love the first one and never gave it a shot. The next game I want to talk about is just because of the pedigree of its series. It's Gun Griffin Allied Strike, and it's the fourth game in the Gun Griffin series by Game Arts. The first two were released on the Sega Saturn. The first one came out over here. The third one, Gun Griffin Blaze, was released on the PS2, and that came out over here. And it's just kind of a typical mech game, but because it's a Game Arts game and some of them were put out by Working Designs, I think it's worth noting. Right after that, we get Mech Assault 2 Lone Wolf. So Mech Assault 1 was a huge Xbox Live game. 2 really pushes that forward. It's the same kind of mech gameplay, but they've added quite a few new features. First off, they've added different vehicles you can get into. They've added ground play, so you can get out of your mech as you run to different mechs or complete other objectives. And you can, if you're in a mech, you can grab onto one of these VTOLs that are flying around and catch a ride. So a lot of welcome additions to the game. I think it's a smart way to enhance that first game. Definitely worth checking out. Next up is Oddworld Stranger's Wrath. So if you want to go back to my rant from last video, here they are doing it again. We're hoping for the third game in the Oddworld series. Instead, we get this other spin-off, but it is great. So it's hard to hate it. It's a really cool, interesting game. You play this character known as the Stranger. He's got a gun that can pretty much shoot whatever you find in the environment, so you can pick up different creatures and that becomes different ammo types and you use that. It's a really interesting, smart, odd take on the first-person shooting genre, so I highly recommend it. It's been remastered for lots of things now, so you can easily find it. The next one I want to mention just because of its creator, and that's American McGee's Scrapland. So, American McGee is most famous for Alice and Alice Madness Returns. Scrapland was his attempt to make a new franchise, and it didn't quite go that well. It takes place in this robotic junkyard, and you fly around and complete different objectives. Again, it's interesting, but didn't quite live up to the expectations. That brings us to another Star Wars game. You might think I'm putting every Star Wars game in this list, but I'm not. There's quite a few that came out that I'm not mentioning, but Republic Commando is one that is not talked about enough, and you need to play it. It is a really cool game. You control this squad of Republic Commandos. Each has a different kind of ability, and it's a third-person shooter where you kind of guide your squads through, and what makes it really fun is the banter between the commandos. So the story is interesting. The way these Republic Commandos relate to each other as they go through the mission is just really clever and fun. It's definitely a game worth checking out in the Star Wars universe. Next up is a game that not many people played, but a lot of people have been hearing about it the last couple of years, and that is Phantom Dust. So this is a game that Microsoft commissioned kind of to appeal to Japanese gamers. It was created by the creator of the Panzer Dragoon games, and it is a weird mix of a third-person action game and a collectible card game. The game is really interesting. It's set in this kind of apocalyptic future version of Tokyo. You go up to the surface and complete different objectives. It's a really neat game. It's got a unique style. There's been all kinds of trouble with the sequel that Microsoft announced was supposed to be a big deal, and then they kept pushing it back, and it just released a couple months ago as a free-to-play game that I haven't checked out. I'm kind of scared to, but this original game is still great and worth checking out. Next up is Myst 4 Revelation. If you heard my rant on Myst 3 in the last episode about how much I love that series and how great the story is, Myst 4 is a game definitely worth checking out. Even if you missed Myst 3, if you played Myst, this is a great follow-up because this game goes back to a big question fans had at the end of Myst 1, which is what happened to Atreus' sons? And the answers come out here. You see his daughter grown up, you find out what happens to his sons, and stuff goes down. I won't say too much. It's a great story. It is a great game. So I know it's easier to play on PC, but it's still cool that this came out on Xbox. I wish Myst 5 had come out on a console, but it didn't. So, well. Next up is another game I don't have anymore because I've purchased the remastered version on another system, and that is Doom 3. So Doom 3, I felt like it didn't quite live up to the expectations set by Doom 1 and 2. It came out and was a very different experience. It was a much more slow-paced, much more horror-based first-person shooter. Some of those Doom tropes were still in play, but it wasn't quite the Doom people were looking for. Next up is Jade Empire, which is BioWare's next game. So I said earlier, Obsidian took over Old Republic, and BioWare moved on to their next thing, and that happened to be Jade Empire, which is a very interesting RPG in their style. This one takes place in this kind of mythical version of Imperial China where, martial arts and magic kind of reign. You're a student at this martial arts school that gets attacked by enemies and your master's taken, so you set out to save him. And along the way, you meet compatriots, you form alliances, and it's a good stepping point to see how Star Wars, The Old Republic got to Mass Effect, because a lot of the tropes that we see in Mass Effect are set up here. Things like romance and even this, it's got the same kind of ending as Mass Effect 2 where depending on who lives you get different story bits at the end. So overall a really cool game. If you haven't played it, it is worth checking out. I know it's not as highly regarded as BioWare's other RPGs, but still a cool game. Which brings us to Unreal Championship 2, which I found shortly after I did my first episode, and I'm looking forward to checking it out. Apparently it has a single-player mode, so I'm not sure if the first one did. It sounds like it may have. Again, it's just tournament-based mode, so I doubt it'll be as fun as Unreal 2 in my opinion, but I'm still going to check it out. Coming out now as opposed to a couple weeks before Xbox Live when the first Unreal Championship came out, this one really leverages all of the features of Xbox Live. It also is based on that same engine as the first game, but they've just added a ton of new stuff to it, so it's really kind of the most definitive Unreal Tournament experience you can get on the original Xbox. So we talked about Project Gotham Racing way back near the beginning of the first part of this series, and I said that Microsoft had two big exclusive racing series, and we're finally getting to the second one, Forza Motorsport. whereas Project Gotham Racing was a more arcadey take on racing. Forza Motorsport was created to compete with Gran Turismo. This is the sim game. This one's online enabled, so yeah, you can play on Xbox Live, but really it's that Gran Turismo experience of real kind of realistic racing, a ton of cars. It also started the trend that you'll see in later Forza games of giving you all kinds of assists to really help players like me who suck at driving games. So, you know, again, this thing's not worth much now that later Forza games have come out, but it's interesting to see where the series came from. Advent Rising is a game I've always wanted to play. I've just never really found the time. I really do need to play through it and see what the whole thing is like. It's a third-person sci-fi adventure game with a story written by Orson Scott Card. It was designed to be a trilogy. They had all kinds of promotions and stuff behind it, but it bombed, and so we never saw anything else about it. I think the promotions were even canceled. If I look on the back here, yeah, through Xbox Live, you could enter to win $1 million and all kinds of other stuff. It looked like there was an ARG in place. It still sounds cool when I read it, regardless of all the, you know, crap it got for having technical issues and just not doing well. It's still something I want to check out, so I will get to that sometime soon. Next up is Still Life, which is another adventure game. This one you play a cop trying to solve a series of murders. Again, I love these kind of thriller adventure games, these point and click ones. This one is a little less point and clicky than like Siberia. You move your character around, you interact with stuff and investigate crime scenes, and I think it's a pretty cool game. There was a sequel for PC. I wish that had come out on consoles, but you know, I'll take what I can get. Next up, a highly sought-after Xbox game, not quite as sought-after as the N64 version, but Conker Live and Reloaded. So Conker's Bad Fur Day was released for N64, was a pretty big hit, I would say, at the time. It's this kind of cutesy platformer that Rare was known for, except it was filled with different vulgarities and toilet humor and the kind of stuff that is pretty funny. It had Matrix parodies and Saving Private Ryan parodies and all kinds of stuff. It was a really interesting take, even if the gameplay didn't quite hold up. The Xbox version introduces an online mode that, you can play these different scenarios online. It's pretty interesting. I have some pretty big problems with this version, mostly because of the online mode. The combat for single player mode was changed to match. And the combat, even though it's a third-person platformer, they tried to make the combat work kind of like a first-person shooter. So you're strafing a lot, you're trying to look with the right stick, and it doesn't work, in my opinion, for a platformer like this. It makes it hard to play. So even though the graphics are way better and it's a great game to start with, this version isn't one I absolutely love, but it's one that I keep because of its rarity value and because it's Conker. Around this time, the Halo multiplayer pack was out, so you could get a new disc that had a bunch of new maps for Halo 2. Again, it's kind of useless now, but at the time that was a big deal. That brings us to Sid Meier's Pirates, which in this generation, this was the only version you could get on consoles. I believe it came out for Wii later, maybe PSP. In any case, I really love this game. I'm not a big sim fan. This is less of a sim. It's more of one of those like Romance of the Three Kingdoms games. It's based on an old PC game by the same name that is very much kind of strategy heavy. It's all about managing your assets and inventory and managing your crew. This one is much more streamlined. It's way easier to play. It's got an interesting story that helps you carry through instead of just your basic, instead of just managing the strategy elements all the time. The ship combat is fun. The kind of social aspects of it and kind of managing the different factions in the game is pretty fun. I dig this game quite a bit. Next up is Tecmo Classic Arcade. Now, I love these arcade anthologies. There's quite a few of them that have come out, and they keep coming out on new machines. But I think this is the only version for any console of this Tecmo collection that comes with some great games, including like the arcade version of Tecmo Bowl, Rygar, Tecmo Cup. There's 11 different games in it. So, Bomb Jack, Star Force, Solomon's Key, just these cool arcade ports that never came out anywhere else. Next up is Ninja Gaiden Black. So taking, that super popular Ninja Gaiden game that was just everyone had to play on Xbox. And this bundled in some of the DLC packs that you could get through Xbox Live. The difficulties were changed. There were new difficulties added. You know what? The last thing I need is for this game to be any harder, but this is still a very fair, very fun version of the game. Following that, we get Kingdom Under Fire Heroes, which is a prequel to Kingdom Under Fire The Crusaders. I can't find too much about it. It is a game I'm looking forward to, so I'm going to try and find that alongside Crusader. It sounds like it could be the same as Crusader, but maybe they threw in some more of the original RTS elements. In this game, the player can control 5 different armies on the battlefield, and they can control any hero that enters the battlefield, so it sounds pretty interesting. Next up is Far Cry Instincts. So this was the first Far Cry game. It was released on Xbox. Now obviously you can play the Predator version for Xbox 360, so you don't need that one anymore, but it was still cool that it came out around that time. Following that was Doom 3 Resurrection of Evil. So this was kind of a standalone expansion to Doom. It had the original Doom 1 and 2 included on there. It also had 12 new single-player missions that continue the story from Doom 3 and 4 new multiplayer modes. So a ton of new content for people who love Doom 3. Following that, for FPS fans, you get the Halo Triple Pack. So this special pack included Halo 1, 2, and that multiplayer maps. I think this thing might be pretty rare. So if you see it, pick it up. Following that, we get another first-person shooter, Serious Sam 2, which is a game that I think is worth mentioning because the Serious Sam, the first game anyway, was just hugely popular. It had a bit of a cult following and was considered just an amazing FPS, so it was great to see it come to consoles. Although 2 wasn't considered as good, it was still neat to see that come to consoles. Now you can pick up the Serious Sam collection for 360, so you probably want to go that route, but at the time this was neat. Following that, we get Fable: The Lost Chapters, which is an updated version of Fable, which I mentioned earlier. This one contains 9 new areas and 16 new quests that enhance the story a bit. It's got tons of new weapons and items and stuff like that too, so again, that's decent. Although now the Fable Anniversary has come out for 360, so that's the version I have. Following that, we get Stubbs the Zombie Rebel Without a Pulse. This is a cool game that was built on the Halo engine. I mean, they tout that a lot. It doesn't really mean much. The game, it takes place in an alternate futuristic version of the 1960s where you control this zombie who's attacking this town. And so you go in, you attack the people in this town, you change them into zombies, and you use them to complete different objectives and get through the town. It's a pretty interesting take on the third-person action genre. Following that, we get Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth. One of, I think, 3 announced Cthulhu games at the time. I don't know if 1 or 2 of the other ones did come out on PC, but this one was really cool for the time, despite some technical issues. A really cool, atmospheric, first-person shooter. Sanity obviously plays a big part of it. It's just a nicely paced, fun, well, it's not fun because it's Cthulhu, but a cool game. Really twisted, really worth checking out. Following that, a couple more games I don't have. First up, Sega GT Online. So this is an updated version of Sega GT 2002. Basically, they just added some new cars and they've added online mode so you could play Sega GT Online. Right after that, we get Half-Life 2, which was a bad port of the game. You're way better off to play the orange box version, but still really notable because Half-Life and Half-Life 2 had both been rumored to come to consoles for a long time. We did get the PlayStation 2 port of Half-Life 1, which also wasn't a great port. Half-Life 2 was in development for the Dreamcast at some point, but cancelled, so it was nice to see it come out here. Following that, we get Far Cry Instincts Evolution. This launched the same day as the 360 version Predator. This is kind of a new standalone expansion to Far Cry 1's single-player content. Again, you're better off to play the Predator version on 360, but it still was cool to have this second version on the Xbox. Next up is Dreamfall: The Longest Journey, the follow-up to the huge smash PC adventure game, The Longest Journey. It takes that story and it goes in a new direction. It introduces new characters and really kind of enhances that world quite a bit. It's a great game. The sequel was recently kickstarted and released called Dreamfall Chapters, which is good because it ends on a pretty big cliffhanger. Next up is a game I find really interesting, but I don't know if I love it or hate it. It is called Cyanide, and it is a weird take on the shoot-'em-up genre. The game is completely 3D, but the playing area is 2D. So while you're flying through these 3D tunnels, camera is moving all around like crazy. For the most part, you're restricted to playing it like a twin stick shooter, and that feels really weird when you're trying to shoot something ahead of you and you really can't, because it's hard to get that field of play in your head. But once you do get used to it, it is a pretty cool game. The story is really interesting, surprisingly, for a shoot 'em up like this. There was a sequel released on the PSP in Europe only. Again, just worth checking out for shoot 'em up fans, because the Xbox really didn't have many shoot 'em ups. Lastly, Sneak King, one of 3 Burger King games. You could go to Burger King, pay $5 each, and pick up these 3 games. There was Sneak King, there was Pocket Bike Racers, and there was Big Bumpin'. So the other 2 were your kind of kart racers or bumper car game. But Sneak King is something that is just crazy in its own way. It's this kind of stealth game where you play as the Burger King, and you go around different areas and try and surprise people with burgers or fries or whatever. Give them food when they're like, "Oh, thanks for giving me food." It's crazy. It works. It's technically a 360 game, but the disc also includes the Xbox version, so you can play it on both 360 or Xbox long before backwards compatibility was around, right near the end of the system's life cycle. Which brings us to the last 2 games released for the console, which are only notable for being the last 2 games, and they're fitting given the audience of the original Xbox. The first is Madden 2008, which came out in August of 2007, and then the last game the following year was, of course, Madden 2009, which came out in August 2008. So Madden had a huge following on Xbox. None of the games are particularly notable, because if you love Madden, you just play the recent one or the best one. But again, it's still interesting to see how a system ends off. So thanks for checking out this episode. I had a blast doing it. I'm real excited to see what games I missed out on Xbox and go back and try those. I really hope that this backwards compatibility for Xbox One supports a lot of games. Like I said earlier, the system had about 887 games, and over 460 were backwards compatible on the 360, so we should at least get all of those. But there's still some pretty big omissions there, so I hope we get more. This was a system that I think a lot of people didn't get the chance to play. I mean, at the time, you had your GameCube and your PS2, and the Dreamcast had just failed, so a lot of people skipped out on this, and I think it had this reputation of being a kind of frat boy system for people that just play Madden and Halo, but there were a ton of great games on it. If you're a Sega fan, you owe it to yourself to try all those Sega exclusives. The Star Wars games are great. There's just pretty much everything I mentioned I find worth playing, and that doesn't even count the third-party stuff or the multi-platform stuff, because there are so many multi-platform games that are just better on this system. If unless the game really requires 4 shoulder buttons, you probably want to play it on Xbox, because it's just, in this day and age, it looks so much better. It's a way better way to experience those old titles. And the new backwards compatibility is supposed to make all those games look even better, so no need for upscalers or any of that stuff. It's coming at a great time, because like I said in my first video, the Xboxes are kind of dying. The faulty capacitors are leaking through the boards. The system has never been emulated properly, so you can't emulate them like you can most PS2 games. I highly recommend checking out some of these titles. Thanks for checking out this episode. Please like, share, subscribe, all that stuff. If you dig it, we're a small channel and we really appreciate all the support we're getting. We're going to keep doing these retrospectives. I wanted to do Saturn before I did this one, but that's going to be next. So I'll see you next time. Bye.